Hi everyone, and welcome to our video lecture on measurement in surveys. So for today, we're going to be talking about thinking through data, specifically survey data, and including best practices in survey questions. So what should you be doing right now? You should be thinking about your research design. So what case or cases are you going to be focusing on if you are opting for qualitative analyses? Or if you are doing quantitative analyses, what universe of cases are you looking at? So here you want to be thinking, if you're both doing qualitative work or quantitative work, how you are going to be measuring your dependent and independent variables. And you got a little bit of a head start on that with last week's activity. But in any case, if you are struggling along any dimension with research design, which is totally normal, please come see me. So most of you are likely going to be relying on existing sources to create your measures for your dependent and independent variables, which is where last week's week 8 lecture on different sources of data comes in. So if you're measuring something like democracy, you might rely on Freedom House or Polity. Or if you're looking at something like the quality of government, you might measure, that project has measures of religious freedom and corruption and gender equality, a variety of different things in the comparative context. In any case, though, you really should be having you should be thinking, am I going to be using pre-existing measures, or do I have to make any measures? And that's really the focus of today. Some of you really are going to be making your own measures or creating your own measures. For those of you who are using pre-existing data, you're likely going to be relying on last week's lectures. But for those of you who might be creating their own data, their own measures, that's the focus of this week. And really, we're going to be talking about two strategies to create your own variables. And even if you're not using it for this project, I would still advise that you stay tuned through this lecture, because this really does lay the groundwork for you to be able to field your own questions, your own surveys in subsequent projects. So the focus of this week, we're going to be talking about surveys, and the other lecture is going to focus on content analysis. Now, surveys are a series of questions that are answered by a respondent or a set of respondents. And really, you're trying to accurately measure people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And this might seem straightforward, but it's actually quite complex, and there is a significant amount of science that goes into designing surveys, survey questions, and the mode in which they are delivered. In any case, you should be using simple language. So oftentimes political scientists, we use jargony language among ourselves. So things like saying political behavior, when that means did you vote? But you don't want to be using that on surveys, because you want it to be accessible to regular people. So my primary recommendation, if you opt to do some kind of survey, either in this project or in the future, look at how other survey firms have asked those questions before, and employ them in your own survey. Because chances are, if places like Gallup, if places like Pew, if ANES or GSS or CES use specific question wording to capture concepts like political knowledge or democratic efficacy, something like that, you can use that wording that they have used, because they put a lot of research into what would be the best way to ask that question, right? So it's a reliable measure. So again, I would just say, if you do ever field your own survey, look to other professional survey firms, how they have written those survey questions, and pull from them. That is what most professionals do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of questions. So you can have a close-ended question. So this is where you have a question stem. While watching television, have you ever had a fatal heart attack? This is the question stem. And then the answer choices are often, some of the time, only now and then, hardly at all, never. And it's close-ended because you're not giving respondents any alternative options besides these 5 options, right? This is a close-ended question. They don't have to type or give any unusual kind of response. Their options are limited to these 5 answer choices. That's what makes it close-ended. Now, an open-ended, by contrast, is what is the most important problem facing the United States today. And here, people can write whatever they want. So common answers might be something like the economy, immigration, democracy, polarization. But people can write whatever, and it could be something top of mind, like breaching the dams, or it could be something more traditional like the economy. But you should know that you are going to get a wide variety of answers because people can answer however they want. They just sort of type in this box right here. Now, the difference, though, is you can see there aren't 5 options that people can select from. It's literally whatever is top of mind for someone when in response to this question. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to using this, to using open-ended questions. If any of you have ever seen Family Feud, which is such a fun show, you know that sometimes the answers where they poll everyone, like, name something you might put on top of a salad. Other people can say things like dressing, tomatoes, carrots, and then this man says whipped cream. Like the idea there is that you can get some really unusual responses that don't necessarily fit neatly in to what you expected and your coding scheme. So just to briefly note, some of the advantages are that it gives people space to express their detailed views on issues. You really are not going to you're going to get a lot of nuance from these answers. You're not going to pigeonhole people into those 5 or 6 response options. You are going to be getting a lot of detail. And that's really great, especially if you're exploring a concept that hasn't been explored a lot before. And there's also a lot of research on even very well established concepts like trust, where some scholars argue that we need to be using open-ended answers to better get at some of those measures, right? That like our conception of trust and how we ask about it on survey questions isn't fully complete. So open-ended might make more sense. But there are some pretty significant disadvantages. One of them is that if you have all of these open-ended options, these open-ended responses, they become difficult to code because you get a lot of unusual things too, and they might not neatly fit into one response option. So someone could say something like immigration and trade policy, right? So is the top pressing problem immigration or is it trade policy? How do I code that? Or maybe they choose something that nobody else has said. Like, do I count that? Do I put that in other? It becomes hard on me as the analyst to code all of these, but also it is a bit of a burden for respondents. People get pretty tired of having to answer a lot of open-ended questions. Even 1 or 2 can prove to be too much. So if you ask open-ended questions, there's a possibility that they won't answer or they might stop the survey altogether. So there are risks with employing open-ended questions. Now, we do have some question guidelines that we'll go through real quick. So you should be choosing the appropriate question format. That's number 1. Number 2, make sure the question applies to the respondent, and I'll show you that one in a second. You should also be asking 1 question at a time, not multiple questions, a double-barreled question, that kind of thing. You also need to use specific and concrete words to specify concepts. The other thing is that you need to make sure that yes means yes and no means no. That means no double negatives in your questions. You also, when asking either/or types of questions, you need to state both the positive and negative side in the question stem. And if you have a list of answer categories, this is the 7th one, you need to include all reasonable possible answers. So I'll give you some examples. So choose the appropriate question format. This first one is a nominal question, which means that there is no ranking to the response options, right? Please choose one of many answer categories that apply to them. So if I ask something like, who is your favorite Kardashian? And then I give you Kim, Kanye, Kris, Kendall, and Rob, there is no ranking to them. This is a nominal question. I should be clear too, these nominal questions are very common in political science surveys. So they can be things like, what is your religion? Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, atheism, right? And like there is no ranking implied there. Or I could ask, what is your race? Black, white, Asian, Native American. Again, there's no ranking implied there. Those are nominal response options. And I know you're like, why is she drilling this in so much? This becomes very relevant, especially when you are doing more advanced research methods and statistical analyses. Alternatively, you can have ordinal questions. So people place themselves on a scale ranging from low to high or high to low. So I could ask something like, how is your day going? And the response options have an ordering to them. The worst, bad, meh, good, the best. Obviously, there is an order here going from the worst to the best. Okay. And these are ordinal questions. In other words, there is an order to the response options. It's different than nominal where there wasn't an order. Now, you need to also make sure that the question applies to the respondent. So not every question is applicable to every person. So for instance, if you are asked about social media, something like, do you have social media? Yes or no? And you say no. And then you are asked, how often do you use social media? You just told them that you don't use social media, right? So you don't want to ask people questions for things that don't apply to them. Okay. The other example is you don't want to be asking questions about children if respondents don't have children. I'm not going to ask someone with no children, how much do you spend on childcare every month? Because that's an irrelevant question and it fatigues them, right? It also might lead to confusing answers, right? If they're sort of forced to respond. If you have worked in any survey platforms before, which some of you might by the end of your program here, so something like Qualtrics, on most survey platforms, you can program to skip. So if I ask you, do you have children? Yes or no, and you click no, then it's going to skip the page that asked about all of those like children questions, like how much you spend on childcare and how many children you have. For people who answer no, it's going to skip that next set of questions. The next one is ask one question at a time. You really want to avoid double-barreled questions that ask about two concepts, but only allows one answer. So I don't want to ask you, how much did you enjoy how much did you like Squid Games and Stranger Things? That's because that's technically two questions. There are lots of people who maybe didn't like Squid Games but enjoyed Stranger Things, or didn't like Stranger Things but liked Squid Games. But because I've conflated it into one, that now becomes a confusing answer. So what might be a solution? You just break it out into two questions instead. How much did you like Squid Games? Question 1. How much did you like Stranger Things? Question 2. Now, you also want to be using specific and concrete words to specify concepts. You don't want to have vague concepts because respondents oftentimes interpret things differently than what you intended. And then your survey questions might be less useful for analysis. So make sure that all of your words are clear and specific. So for instance, many years ago, I fielded a survey that asked, are you a transportation authority? And nearly all respondents said yes, because they were all this kind of transportation authority, except one. And this person responded like, no, and that's because I myself am not a transportation authority, but they were like the executive of one. So that was vague on my part, right? I should have asked instead, is your primary place of employment a transportation authority? Okay. Now, a similar one is, did you vote in the last election? That's unclear to many people because what is the last election? So in Idaho, the last election could have been the May election, or maybe it meant the May like bond and levy election, or it means the 2024 presidential election, right? It's not specific. Instead, you would want to ask something like, did you vote in the last presidential election in November 2024? You want to be very specific so that people are recalling what you are referring to. Now, the next thing I will note is you don't want to be using double negatives. So this is an example at the top of a question containing a double negative. Do you favor or oppose not allowing the state to raise taxes without approval of 60% of the voters? Favor or oppose? What? Favor or oppose not allowing the state to raise taxes? What? So that's what's going to happen to a lot of your respondents. The double negative is going to throw them off and they might get confused and answer wrong, or they might not answer at all, right? And you really don't want that. So here is a revision to remove the double negative. Do you favor or oppose requiring 60% approval by voters in order to raise state taxes, right? And that's much more clear because it doesn't have this double negative, favor or oppose not allowing the state, right? Alternatively, you could provide even more information, which is what a lot of surveys do. In the September election, you will be asked to vote on this referendum. No state tax can be raised without approval by 60% of those voting in a statewide election. If the election were held today, would you vote for or against approval, right? It provided more context about the question itself, and there was not a double negative in the question. Okay. The next one is you want to be stating both the positive and negative side in the question stem. So how satisfied are you with the overall service you have received from your financial consultant? This is only the positive side. It's asking how satisfied are you? And it gives the same response options: very satisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, very dissatisfied. But really, you need to have both, right? You need to have both in your question stem. How satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the overall service you have received from your financial consultant? And then you have the same for response options. The final thing is you need to develop lists of answer categories that include all reasonable possible answers. This is especially true for nominal questions. So every respondent needs to have a category that they can place themselves in. So for instance, if I asked, what is your religion? And I only gave the options Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, none, right? There are a variety of others that are missing, right? We are missing Judaism, for example, right? And you also would probably want to include atheism and agnosticism. And then you would even want other as a response option, right? Where people can complete that further. In any case, though, you need to have a complete set of response options that include all reasonable possible answers so that respondents don't go like, well, I don't see my religion here, right? And like make them pause. You want response options to reflect people's preferences so they feel like they can choose a response that most accurately reflects them. So again, what we have done is for this lecture talked about, for those of you who are not doing, not using other people's data, but perhaps running a survey yourself, we talked about survey data, survey questions, right? Including best practices in survey questions. So for those of you who are thinking about doing your own survey, this is probably super useful. For those of you who aren't yet doing a survey for this project, I'd still encourage you, like, this is a good chance to start becoming familiar with the use of surveys in political science because it's probably like half of the discipline. But if you have any questions about this, just let me know.